is power. And the Lord told me, in talking about communion, this is the beginning of talking about power. That we're right on track here toward the end of the year, finishing up talking about power, and we begin with Holy Communion, which is a entering into the bedchamber. It's like, what could that little Moabitess Ruth do working in barley fields compared to what she could do in the bedchamber giving birth to the grandfather of King David? And out of that intimacy with Boaz, who's a type of Redeemer, who is the Redeemer, is a type of Jesus, out of that intimacy with Jesus and the consummation of the marriage covenant, that's where fruit and destiny and purpose is birthed. And that is the prophetic, symbolic, but more than that, the actual flesh and blood that allows that to happen. It blows my mind. Think about that. Okay, I want to mention just a couple of things in talking about what the early church saw in communion. And I want to start in Luke 24. And this is the story. It's after the resurrection, when Jesus was he's in his resurrected body, and he's appearing to different people in different situations. And it's really interesting to me that nobody recognizes him at first. Like in our resurrected bodies, we can be shapeshifters. You know, we can look like this one day and look like something else the next day. It's why in heaven, they can change from adults to little children and little children back to adults at will, because we're in our resurrected bodies. And we can, and in worship we can all be little kids, but when we're sitting on the throne ruling, we can be adults, but we're both. We can flip back and forth in our resurrected bodies. We can walk through walls, we can walk in water, we can drink poison and it won't hurt us in our resurrected body. And this right here, as the flesh of Jesus, all right, let's think about this. Is Jesus said, this is my flesh, eat my flesh, and he likened it to manna in the wilderness that came from heaven. This flesh, it came from heaven. It's better than the manna, because when you eat the manna, you're still going to die, but when you eat my flesh, you'll never die. So is he talking about his flesh before the resurrection or after the resurrection? It's got to be after, right? It's got to be after. And that's a big deal with me, just to think about that. This is not his flesh when he said it at the Last Supper. This is my flesh, eat it. He wasn't talking about his flesh then. He was talking about his flesh after resurrection, his resurrected flesh that ascended into heaven, that is still in heaven. So his flesh is even now in heaven, in his resurrected body, and we're invited in to eat of that resurrected flesh to transform our bodies into resurrected flesh. I have heard so many stories of people who are able to move in their resurrected flesh. Like they can walk through walls, they can walk on water, they can translate from one country to another country. People are doing all this stuff, guys. There's hundreds of people doing all this stuff. And we're pushing for it. We're contending for it. We're like, okay, if they can, we can too. Testimony of Jesus says the spirit of prophecy in it. If they can do it, so can we. And as we eat his flesh, we eat his resurrected flesh, and we can enter in. Okay, so here's the story. He's on the road to Emmaus. There are two men who are going from Jerusalem. They're going back to Emmaus. They've basically given up. And what are you discussing together as you walk along? Jesus joins them and asks them a question. One of them said, are you only a visitor to Jerusalem and you don't know the things that have happened here in these days? What things? Jesus asked. About Jesus of Nazareth, he was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and all the rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death and they crucified him. But we had hoped. Really important words. But we had hoped. They had given up hope. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And what is more, it's the third day. Others have said he's alive. And then he said to them, how foolish you are and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Christ have to suffer these things and then enter his glory? And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scripture concerning himself. And they approached the village. It was getting late. They asked him to stay. He decided to stay. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. And so they talked about that. They went back to Jerusalem. When they got to Jerusalem, they found the 11. Then the two told what had happened on the way and how Jesus was recognized by them when he broke the bread. Okay, let's think about this a minute. He had just explained to them on a long walk all the prophets. They had heard they had been all of their lives. They had been studying all of these prophetic words about the coming Messiah. And they had 3.5 years with Jesus to figure out that he matched up with everyone, but they still hadn't connected the dots and realized that. And here at the end, they had said, but we had hoped. It was all over. We thought this was the one, but he's not. And he had explained every important prophetic word to them, and even in opening up the word and explaining the word so it all made sense to them, they still had not figured out this is Jesus. Now think about that. But when he broke the bread, oh, that's Jesus. Talk about the spiritual significance of breaking the bread. When I put that together, that was years ago, and it was that day I decided I was going to take communion every day. Because I understood that it was in the breaking of the bread that Jesus reveals himself. And they had lost hope, but they had put their hope in the wrong Jesus, or the wrong impression of who Jesus was. And they needed an altogether different understanding, vision of who Jesus is, and they received it in the breaking of the bread. That he released to them that revelation. And so the early church put so much emphasis on Holy Communion that we don't have today. Like if you go through Acts and in Corinthians it's mentioned again, they met to break bread. And it wasn't to take a meal. Paul made it very clear in 1 Corinthians, if you're hungry, eat at home. This is not about eating a meal. But they met to break bread. They met because they knew that in the breaking of the bread, more of Jesus would be revealed to them. So they came together to get more of Jesus. I want to know you better. I want to see who you are. I want to understand the scriptures. I want it to be alive to me. I want to see you like I've never seen you before. I want to eat you. I want to drink you. And I want to receive more of you that I've never yet received before. And in the drinking, in the breaking of the bread, Jesus reveals himself. And in the drinking of the blood, we receive his DNA. And you think about sexual intercourse. A woman receives the DNA of the man, and it's the same. That's the act of Holy Communion. It's the bride of Christ going into the bedchamber as Ruth went to Boaz, as Boaz and Ruth came together. It's the drinking of the blood. It's the commingling of blood. It's the releasing of the birthing, the conception and birthing of more of who Jesus is. It's getting pregnant with Jesus. And at the marriage supper of the Lamb, in that consummation, in that communion, is receiving his DNA. Okay. What do you think?
That's awesome.
Communion was first, as far as I know, the first time was with Melchizedek and Abraham. When Melchizedek brought out bread and wine, it was a recognizing, even then, of the covenant with God and the consummation of the covenant. When you think of the word communion that we use, we're really talking about a man and his wife. We're really talking about Jesus and his wife having communion. We're talking about a commingling of DNA. And it's one way that we can be healed, because as we eat his resurrected flesh, we receive in our bodies his resurrected flesh. And our bodies become one with his body. And we are one more step closer to walking in full resurrection bodies. And when we are able to receive those experiences of walking in resurrection bodies, no sickness and disease can touch us. And we can do it step by step as we take communion and make those confessions and those declarations in communion, in the taking of communion, that I eat your flesh, Jesus, and every cell of my body, I receive into it a cell of your body. And our cells become one. And my DNA must yield to your DNA. And it's the healing of our DNA where we find freedom from all kinds of sickness and disease. And then in the blood covenant, without blood there's no remission of sin, there's no forgiveness of sin. So all the forgiveness of sin is received in the taking of the wine or the grape juice. But in Hebrews it says, the high priest never entered in without blood. And so when we drink the blood, it's not just sprinkled on us, it's actually received inside us. The old covenant was about the outward, but the new covenant is about the inward. So when we drink his blood, our hearts, souls, bodies, spirits, minds, all of us are aligned with his blood. And the enemy cannot touch us. There was a story about John G. Lake that he had such a revelation of the blood covenant that his blood actually let off light. I tried to find the documentary on that this afternoon. I couldn't find it. But it's in his biographies. The revelation he walked in.